Good evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce someone who is very far from a stranger to us. Claudia Glatz has been with us this year, courtesy of a Leverhulme International Academic Fellowship, given to her to accomplish two things. First, to finish her book, Empire in the Making, Hittite Expansion and Local Responses in LBA Anatolia, and second, to develop a collaborative research in the context of one of her projects, the Sirwan Upper Diyala Regional Project, with which she's currently working with Jesse Kasana at the University of Arkansas. So it's a wide, it's an expansive grant, a wide-ranging grant, and that matches Claudia's wide-ranging scholarly profile. She's a 2007 doctorate from University College London. In fact, she, what they would say in England, she's UCL man and boy, except translate. BA, MA, PhD. And she's published extensively on the Hittites. I used to hate the Hittites. And, I've sort of kind of come, I have had between Claudia and Hugo and Felipe, anyway, so I still hate the Nabateans, but the Hittites I am beginning to live. She's published on Hittite ceramics, frontiers, their landscapes, their monuments, their landscape monuments, and more. She's also extremely active in field work, co-directing projects in Turkey, and again, the Sirwan Upper Diyala River, which is in the Kurdish region of Iraq, which she assures me is coming back online for field work. She has a very impressive record of grant getting, which again, why we're lucky enough to have her here. With that grant, the Leverhulme for Highland Encounters, Practice, Perception, and Power in the Mountains of the Ancient Middle East. And also from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, she has a major grant for what the British apparently now refer to as a knowledge exchange platform for, better known as workshops and conferences, for the Prehistoric Black Sea Project. So there's lots of terrain covered by our Claudia Glatz, academic and spatial. And now I think we're going to hear about a vertical archipelago, climbing mountains, moving molehills, highland communities, lowland encounters in the Near East. Let's welcome Claudia Glatz.
Thank you, Sue, for this very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. And as many of you know, and Sue already said, I've not just stepped off a plane yesterday, but I've been enjoying the stimulating atmosphere of the Tchaikovsky for some months now. And so this is also my opportunity to thank you all for what has been most enjoyable and, in its own idiosyncratic way, a productive sabbatical so far. So interregional interaction is a universal process in and a fundamental structure and principle of all human societies. Contact between different groups, however, along with meaningful historical process and cultural development, is imagined in most histories of interaction along two dimensions, through time and on the horizontal planes of period maps. A distinctive third, Highland-lowland dimension has, with very few regional exceptions, such as the Andean Highlands, which however presents a topographical inversion of the usual civilizational narrative, received comparatively little interest by those studying the past. Mountains, their inhabitants, and the interaction with them are important and recurrent themes in the histories of the ancient Near East, but such stories are primarily the product of lowland state ideologies that see mountains as imbued with ritual significance on the one hand and as the home of coveted resources on the other. Mountain people, the Kaska, the Lulubai, the Gutians, are invariably portrayed in unfavorable terms in the text and the iconography, casting them as the highland other to lowland civilization and encounters between highland and lowland groups as recursive, antagonistic, and short-term events. This has shaped not only historical and modern perceptions and self-portrayals of highland societies, but also disciplinary practice, which traditionally at least has tended to shy away from the investigations of highland regions as both methodologically difficult and marginal with regards to their contribution to major social and cultural developments. The result is that the majority of ancient Near Eastern highland communities have remained people without history, and for the most part also without archaeology. An engagement with the highlands and their lowland connections, intellectually and with hiking boots on, brings the opportunity to produce new knowledge about communities and their cultural traditions, which are to date either sparsely or not at all documented, but at any rate little understood, and from these vantage points shed new light on old questions, from the unashamedly specific, where are the Kaska, to the broader relationships and processes of what James C. Scott calls the boundary conditions and exchanges between highlands and lowlands that make the lowland centers what they are. What I'm going to talk about today are aspects of a larger ongoing project that explores the encounter between the highland and lowland societies in the ancient Near East through the interconnected themes of identity, perception, and representation on the one hand, and the modes and motivations of interaction and their balance of power on the other. I will focus on two examples of Highland Encounters, both closely connected with my field research in the mountains of northern Turkey and in the Zagros Mesopotamian interface of northeast Iraq. I will first tackle one of Anatolian studies' more intriguing questions, the cultural identity of the Pontic Mountains during the Bronze Age and its inhabitants' spectrum and modes of engagement with central Anatolia and other surrounding regions. In the second part, I will explore issues of perception, representation, and adoption in a landscape-based discourse of power that connects nascent Mesopotamian imperialism with Highland political contest in the western Zagros during the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia BC. Mountains, like all other landscapes, are the product of an ongoing interplay, material and symbolic, between their physical and ecological properties and human engagement with and conception of them. As such, they can be and mean many things, all at once, or to different observers. Mountains, for instance, bound geographical imagination. This is Babylonia's view of itself and the wider world in the first half of the 1st millennium BC. Itself in the center, it is surrounded by other political entities such as Assyria, Elam, and Urartu, the sea, islands beyond, and at the top, the mountain form part of the outer margin. Mountains are also full of precious resources. These are Phoenician ships transporting cedars from the Lebanon to Assyria, but already Sargon of Akkad, over 1.5 millennia earlier, talks of the Silver Mountains and the cedar forests, the Taurus and the Lebanon, which he claims to have conquered at the outer edges of his realm. Difficult to control and surpass, mountains are ideal territorial boundaries, but as such, they may also become contested ground. Think of the Caucasus or Kashmir today, or in the late Bronze Age of Anatolia, where a series of landscape monuments skirts the central Anatolian plateau in often strategic highland locales, marking the locations of ongoing territorial contest. Where political space and culture are meant to coincide, they become ideological watersheds. As the French philosopher Blaise Pascal put it, truth this side of the Pyrenees, error on the other. Either gods themselves or divine dwelling spaces, places where the mountains hold religious significance in the ancient world as today. But mountains are also undomesticated and wild places where the plow does not go, as a Hittite source puts it. They are populated by fearful mythical creatures such as Gilgamesh's Humbaba, and are places where social rules are suspended. Hittite women, by law the culprit when assaulted in settlement contexts, were not expected to be able to defend their virtue in mountain contexts. Highlands and lowlands, too, are concepts not easily defined in absolute terms. We can make broad topographical and ecological distinctions based on altitude, degrees of slope, potential for agricultural intensification, or carrying capacity. But they are really culturally and socially constructed categories, contextually dependent, historically changeable, and above all, complexly intertwined identities and ways of life. In his ethnographic work in Highland Burma, Edmund Leach noted how a person or a family can be both Lowland Shan and Highland Kahin, with all the cultural and linguistic strappings that come with both either identity, depending on the social context and the advantages to be gained. Previous studies characterized the two groups as clearly demarcated, even racially distinct, common tropes in this context, as we shall see. And there is, as ethnographies from Southeast Asia to the Moroccan Atlas have documented, a prominent rhetoric of alterity, often expressed in ethnic terms by both sides, and frequently through binary opposites, barbarous, civilized, wild, cultivated, that serves to separate highland and lowland domains conceptually, yet in daily practice they are closely interdependent and connected entities. What is lost in the wider discourse on the ancient Highland-lowland encounters is then what Leach would say that the maintenance and insistence upon cultural difference can itself be a ritual action expressive of social relations. And it is in the text and the iconography of the ancient Near East that we find the first recorded examples of this rhetoric of difference and the types of relationships they structure and express. The Sumerian story of Enmerkar and the king of Aratta captures it perfectly. The text recounts the contest between Enmerkar, the king of Uruk, with the unnamed ruler of the mythical mountain kingdom of Aratta, somewhere in the Zagros. Officially, the contest is about who is most favored by the goddess of Inanna, but it is really a lowland rationalization of Highland-lowland interaction, its purpose and nature. First, we're told what Mesopotamian elites wanted from the mountains: precious metals, semi-precious stones, especially lapis lazuli, and building materials. It also gives us an idea of the complicated relationship between the highlands and the lowlands, which includes a heady mix of some shared cultural traditions, the worship of Inanna. Economic interdependence: drought-stricken Aratta needs grain from Uruk, Uruk's political economy needs luxuries and building materials from the mountains. And the near-hostile competitiveness manifested in the many seemingly impossible challenges which the king of Aratta imposes on Enmerkar. Most of all, it tells us that lowlanders thought rather highly of themselves. It is Enmerkar's ingenuity and the skill of lowland craftspeople that allow him to meet all of Aratta's challenges. In the end, Enmerkar dwarfs his opponent's challenges with the ultimate invention. To ease communication with the distant Aratta, Enmerkar invents writing and Highland illiteracy all in one elegant sweep. We can trace this opposition across time and space and in various written and pictorial forms. Here, a 19th century depiction of the wild Miao, itself an imperial term of warriors of the mountainous southern region of China. Or in words: as for the highlands, I comprehend them all in two sorts of people. Those who dwell on the mainland are barbarous, yet with some show of civility. Those who dwell in the isles are utterly barbarous, without any sort of show of civility. Ultimately, this translates into an academic debate about the state and those in opposition to it, cultural and political. From Hegel to Brodel and Scott all think, albeit for different reasons, that civilization or the state does not climb hills. The traditional assumption here is that mountain dwellers, like the king of Aratta, are haplessly barbarous, incapable of evolving higher social and cultural organization, except maybe in cases of intensive contact with lowland regions. Alternatively, James Scott suggests that small-scale and less hierarchical social organization, shifting but usually short-term political alliances, greater mobility, which may or may not be directly related to livestock rearing, and certain cultural practices, including a focus on oral traditions or even prideful illiteracy, are successful if reactionary strategies to lowland state-making. Underwritten by the topographic and ecological characteristics of mountain regions, difficult in particular for lowland armies and tax collectors, these traits constitute the art of not being governed. There is certainly a good deal of evidence that links mountains with political and cultural opposition and predicated on these ethnic and regional identities. But only an imperial approach that straddles non-state to state scenarios can assess the applicability of this model to pre-modern Highland-lowland relations and identify alternatives or hybrid scenarios. In practice, this means building a local and long-term picture of Highland regions and to tease from often scarce and disparate sources information about Highland societies, their cultural traditions, and evidence for specific form of lowland relations. Contact between the Near East's highlands and lowlands is attested from the prehistory in the form of obsidian trade and the descent of sedentism and early agriculture from the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent. Highland encounters in the context of early states and their colonial ventures can be traced from the 4th millennium. And one of the most prolonged and textually well documented takes place in north-central Anatolia during the 2nd millennium BC. Here the Hittite state emerged in the late 17th century, and from the 14th to the early 12th managed to bring much of Turkey and northern Syria under varying degrees of imperial control. Starting in the 15th century, the central Black Sea region, just to the north of the Hittite heartland, began to preoccupy Hittite kings and their armies, and several generations of whom campaigned almost annually in the region. The reason for this sudden attention are the Kaska, as the Hittites called them, who we are told attacked, destroyed, and plundered Hittite settlements and cult centers along the northern fringes of the central plateau. Hittite sources demarcate Kaska difference clearly in socioeconomic terms. One source describes them as swineherds and weavers of linen, which differs from at least the Hittite elite's food and textile preferences. They are also portrayed as the perpetual aggressor, who shows no respect for Hittite temples, who is difficult to pin down due to heightened mobility, knowledge of the mountains, and lack of permanently centralized leadership. Sound familiar? There is much talk of empty landscapes and destroyed settlements, which several kings claim to have resettled and refortified with deportees. In some cases, however, the populations resettling those towns appear to be actually captured Kaska, suggesting a degree of ambiguity or even uncertainty about who's friend and foe. As time goes on, Hittite texts begin to point to seemingly regular interactions, from settlement and grazing rights to Kaska Hittite couples and Kaska troops serving on the Hittite side. This created a northern border zone that was both culturally heterogeneous, perhaps more so than other regions due to the influx of deportees, and socially little cohesive or porous. Instructions to commander of border towns, for instance, include directives on what to do if a tenant abandons their allotted fields and then presumably makes off into the mountains. All of these relationships and processes are, of course, embedded in and mediated through material culture. But much like all our textual accounts, our material perspective too is as yet heavily skewed towards a southern, lowland, and therefore arguably Hittite perspective. Between 1997 and 2001, the survey project Paphlagonia brought one stretch of this border zone into sharp archaeological focus. Just to the south of the Ilgas Mountains and along the course of the Devers River, the project documented a string of heavily fortified sites. One of the best preserved is Dumanlekale, whose imposing walls still stand to about 5 meters in places today. In contrast to the recognizably Central Anatolian Middle and Late Bronze Age pottery at the site, the construction technique of the outer fortification wall is not the typical casemate construction of Hittite centers. The segmented facade compares in fact best to Troy 6, which poses the question of the cultural affiliation of those who built it and their association with the Hittite state. Also notable is the presence of a settlement about 500 meters away from the fortified site, whose surface pottery suggests occupation from the early Bronze Age into the late Bronze Age. We see a similar scenario near Ilgas, where two imposing sites, Salmonhoek East and West, control the crossroads between a major east-west communication corridor, the Samsun-Istanbul road today, and the road leading up into the Ilgas Massif towards Kastamonu and ultimately the Black Sea. Salmon West is a low mound whose morphology, traces of in-situ masonry, suggest a well-fortified site of 2nd millennium date. The multi-period Mount of Salmon East provides evidence of the importance of this location from the early Bronze to the Byzantine period. Both sets of sites, I think, would be ideal places to explore this Highland-lowland border zone and its development in more detail. Muga, hurry up with that PhD. To the south, late Bronze Age settlements are more widespread. Many small mounded sites or flat sites on natural spurs, representing agricultural communities or estates, such as those of the late 16th century Inandik-Tepe, which has clear links to the Hittite administration. To the north, late Bronze Age material is sparse. There are 3 sites recorded in southern Kastamonu, an isolated bronze sword from Pınarbaşı cave, and a hoard of metal drinking vessels from Kınık. This gives us a relatively clear archaeological framework for Hittite settlement and political geography at the heart of the Hittite-Kaska interaction zone. But it also leaves us with a rather large and seemingly empty archaeological landscape. Traditionally, the Kaska's sudden burst on the Hittite historical stage is explained by various migration scenarios, preferably of nomads and semi-nomads, which conveniently takes care of the apparent lack of archaeological traces of such an invasion. And so alternatives would be an indigenous population that we have simply not recognized because we haven't looked hard enough, or whose cultural traditions are rooted in and continue from earlier periods, entirely unawares of the 3H system. Also possible is the displacement of the voluntary migration from central or western Anatolian individuals and groups in the course of Hittite state-making, or a combination of them. Finding out more about this was one of the central aims of the Cide Archaeological Project, or CAP, a survey project in northwest Kastamonu, which I directed between 2009 and 2011 in collaboration with Bleda Durin and Emre Sherifolu, and whose final report is about to be published. CAP is the first systematic archaeological investigation of this part of the Turkish Black Sea region, whose challenging mountainous landscapes required the development of a new hyper-intensive method of pedestrian survey combined with traditional Near Eastern extensive methods. Extensive explorations led us to, well, the spectacular late Roman and Byzantine and medieval castles, bridges, churches, but also caves in use during the Chalcolithic, Bronze, and early Iron Ages. Intensive pedestrian survey allowed us to contextualize these sites in their wider archaeological landscapes. And in this way, CAP was able to extend the known history of the region by about 10,000 years and to identify several periods, including the Late Bronze Age, which had not been recorded previously anywhere along the Black Sea coast. The most interesting trends emerge, however, when we take a long-term and multi-scalar perspective and place CAP in its wider regional context. This allows us to identify highly localized cultural practices and their long-term continuity, and by extension cultural diversity over relatively short geographical distances. At the landscape scale, this finds expression in the choice of settlement and activity locations and the persistence of particular places. At the artifact level, it manifests itself in localized building techniques and materials, and in the continuity of technological traditions. At the same time, imported obsidian, ceramic styles, and consumption practices, as well as technological adoption or importation of craftspeople, tie the region into a much wider world, defying general notions of highland isolation on the one hand, and allowing us to identify a set of specific non-violent interaction scenarios with the Hittite realm on the other. Evidence for Bronze Age communities in north-central Anatolia comes from 4 types of sites: mounded huyuks, flat settlements, cemeteries, and caves. These have a distinctive south to north distribution, which is clearly associated with particular types of landscapes, but also tracks significant cultural choices and differences from knowledge and skill of particular building materials and construction techniques, but also community size and organization. Mounds are the result of mud brick architecture and long-term occupation. They represent spatially nucleated settlement, which requires often complex land tenure arrangements among its inhabitants. Such mounds unsurprisingly focus on the plain and hilly landscapes of the north-central plateau and the Kızılırmak Delta. In the mountainous and forested Pontic, true huyuks are rare, although some flat Bronze Age sites are also located on top of natural hills and rocky outcrops, and some look rather deceptively like huyuks, but often lack their long-term occupation history. From a handful of excavated Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age sites, building materials and techniques are diverse and differ along short geographical distances. And they are also distinct from Western and Central Anatolian traditions. So these materials include, for instance, stone slab constructions like this one here at Boya Batkouluklukaya in Inner Sinop. There's also plastered timber attested at the Yasikaya cave in Zonguldak, and wattle and dog construction at Ikistepe. Skirting the mountainous western coast, several caves have also yielded important finds in the past decade, and we'll come back to those in a minute. This is Okshula Valley in the coastal hinterland of Cide. In the distance there you can see Okshula Kale, a limestone outcrop and one of the most iconic and natural features and persistent places in the region. Rising sharply from the surrounding landscape, Okshula Kale is a natural fortress which controls access to the interior and has visual control over much of the coastline. The Kale and surrounding valley are used or settled repeatedly, if not continuously, from the early Holocene to the present. Occupation on the Calais is attested for the first time during the Chalcolithic period and the early Bronze Age in the form of several ashy midden deposits full of pottery, bone and some flint, which accumulated inside a cave that runs underneath the rock outcrop. And surface finds from the fields surrounding the Calais suggest occupation also in the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. A second such persistent place is the cave of Kilic-le-Marase, located 10 kilometers inland from Auxerre and along an inland communication route. Activity in the cave appears to start also in the Chalcolithic and continues until the Byzantine period, but the majority of finds suggest an apex of use in the late 3rd millennium. The handmade pottery from these two sites forms part of a long-standing local technological tradition, which is characterized by an almost exclusive and extensive use of mineral temper. Roughly contemporary traditions in Sinop and in Kastamonu as well as Chankra have different preferences with regards to these technological characteristics, preferring shell and shaft temper. Not only does this index differences in raw materials, but also different knowledge and practice in the production of vessels. For instance, the vessel properties or affordances in contact with heat during firing or cooking, as well as handling. Our vessels tend to be much heavier than their southern and eastern counterparts. Petrographic work by my colleague Richard Jones confirms the local origins of the Auxerre material in particular, which is tempered with crushed calcite or marble, and there are 2 marble quarries within 5 kilometers of the site. The petrographic and chemical signatures of the Kilic-le-Marase material are more diverse, and their formal and decorative elements also suggest wide-ranging connections with central and western Anatolia, Thrace and the Balkans, and all of which were absorbed and amalgamated in what is a unique assemblage. And this is also characteristic of the Chalcolithic and early Iron Age material, that it references other regions, different regions, but as an assemblage they are as yet unique. The morphology of Kilic-le-Marase and the difficulty in which it is accessed. There's a steep climb up the mountain cliff and then a 6-meter drop on the other side to get down to the current cave floor, make it an unlikely habitation site. So I think this cave was used, so the dramatic natural setting, long-term use since the Chalcolithic, and a late 3rd millennium assemblage that's focused on drinking, pouring and short-term storage suggests that we're dealing with a symbolically charged space. I think this cave was used for drinking and feasting, using pottery types that served similar functions in central and western Turkey at the time when such practices were reaching a marked peak as part of elite competition and community practices in the late 3rd millennium. Organic residue work suggests the presence of beeswax in one of the samples, which is often associated with the storage or consumption of alcohol. More work is currently underway, but grape is native to the Black Sea, and so wine is certainly a possibility. Both Kilic-le and Auxerre continued to be the foci of activity during the 2nd millennium. A cooking pot with incised decoration matches Middle Bronze Age Central Anatolian examples from Boğazköy, but is also tempered with the distinctive local crushed marble. A related ware also uses this temper, but is otherwise distinct in terms of firing and surface colors as well as formal types, none of which compare well with known prehistoric or Bronze Age assemblages. I cannot date this pottery with any certainty, but a 2nd millennium date is plausible and therefore an association with the Kaska. By that I mean a Highland community roughly of 2nd millennium date who the Hittite administration may well have referred to in this way. Auxerre is not the only enigmatic localized tradition we found during Cap. Another cave, Diyala, contained a different handmade and as yet unique tradition, with some parallels in the early Iron Age of Boğazköy Büyükaya. And there's a good chance that we missed several more of these local traditions which could help populate similarly empty landscapes in the Iron Age and the Hellenistic periods, as the Cide region becomes more recognizably settled, fortified and tied into wider maritime and land-based networks only really from the Roman period onwards. From Auxerre also comes evidence for the late Bronze Age. This pottery belongs to the wheel-made plainware tradition so typical of Hittite centers and supposedly absent from the region. This, together with its petrographic signature, presents us with concrete and relatively restricted sets of options in terms of their relationships and the types of mobility that could have produced the Auxerre cluster. The fabrics compared to the ones we've seen so far are finer, better fired, lack calcite temper, but petrographic work also suggests a local origin. The use of the potter's wheel is also a definite departure from previous traditions. Wheel forming and wheel throwing are specialist skills that require several years of apprenticeship. This means we're dealing with one or more craft specialists trained in the use of the wheel and the production of standard Central Anatolian material culture. This is either a lowland potter, colonist, itinerant captive or refugee, or a local trained in the same manner somewhere to the south, in the border zone or the Hittite heartland. Any further details of the scenario are at this point speculative, but we can say that the oxular evidence provides us with a new perspective on the modes of Highland-lowland interaction at the time, when the Hittite Kaska hostilities appeared to flare up in the 15th century BC. Based on the long-term perspective of Gide's cultural development, we can now also say that there is no need for an invasion scenario of either settled or nomadic groups. There is clear evidence for an indigenous Bronze Age population with deeply rooted and highly localized cultural traditions and a sense of place, and one that is also clearly distinguishable from relatively close neighbors, yet also connected to the wider world. So far we've seen that mountains and their inhabitants get a fair amount of attention in lowland written sources and the particular perspectives that they paint of these encounters. But what about other forms of representation? In abstract form, a cone with scales, mountains appear in a range of artistic genres from Mesopotamia to Anatolia and quite a bit beyond. Depiction of specific mountains and their inhabitants are much rarer. And with the exception of this earliest example, a Çatalhöyük mural, probably showing the volcano of Hasan Dağ as it erupts, representations of geographically specific mountains are associated with the projection of a particular expansive political ideology. This ideology is built on a discourse of otherness that is itself predicated on knowledge of distant peoples and landscapes acquired by royal heroes on their military expeditions. Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs go into great detail and specific detail in their representation of conquered people and landscapes. The first attested example of this type of monument, however, dates to the later 3rd millennium BC. Depicted on the victory stele of Naram-Sin, king of Akkad, one of Mesopotamia's first expansive polities, is a rugged tree-clad mountain whose inhabitants, the Lulubai, Naram-Sin claims to have defeated in the accompanying cuneiform inscription. Irene Vinta identified the trees on the stele as a variety of oak native to the western Zagros, while the red sandstone may have been quarried from the Jebel Hamrin, the westernmost Zagros outlier. Wearing animal skins and long-plaited hair, Lulubai cultural difference and inferiority is clearly stated. They also contrast sharply with their chaotic tumbling down the mountain and in various stages of undress to Naram-Sin's and his soldiers' orderly march uphill. The stele would have been displayed originally in the temple precinct of Sippar, a Mesopotamian city, where it served in the political production within lowland Mesopotamia's fragmentary landscape of city-states. And so it was not primarily intended to remind the Lulubai of their defeat. But sometimes history also has a sense of irony. About 1,000 years later, the stele was taken to Susa, Highland, Iran, as booty by the 12th century Elamite king, Shutuk-Nahunte, who inscribed it with his own victory over lowland Mesopotamia. But I'd like to stay in the 3rd millennium, as it is this climate and of unprecedented lowland expansionism into the mountains and the simultaneous or resulting phase of highland political centralization and competition that motivated the construction of landscape monuments in the Zagros foothills in the late 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Much like the late Bronze Age Anatolian landscape monuments, the Zagros reliefs are also placed on or near strategic mountain passes associated with access to the fertile Sharazor High Plateau or the Iranian highlands. What clearly links them to the Naram-Sin stele is the depictive theme, the overall composition and style in which the triumphant male warrior king is depicted standing over dead or pleading enemies. This is the Bendigaur carved into the rock face of the 3,500 meter high Karada mountain range. The Bendigaur is thought to be the oldest of the Zagros reliefs because of its clear resemblance with the Naram-Sin stele, and which must have served as its inspiration. Or was it the other way around? The monument has no accompanying inscription, and the arguments put forward for a later date are for the most part based on an unfaltering belief in the creative superiority of lowland elites and their craft specialists. But regardless of which came first, or rather this isn't a question we're going to solve here, even if it's clearly an important one, what is equally interesting are the evidently close connections between the monuments and the relationships and forms of interaction they imply. Much like in the case of the pottery from Cide, these were intensive, prolonged, and repeated interactions, and some suggest the acquisition of craft skills and knowledge, cuneiform writing for one, or people who possess it are rather specific. More generally, they speak of a level of shared cultural understanding of the purpose and power, not just of the general image of male royal victory, which is easily enough cross-culturally recognizable, but of the carvings as shamlu, a royal image is ontologically equivalent, one could argue, to or personifying the person depicted. At least that is what implied by some of the accompanying inscriptions. None of the Zagros reliefs simply copies the stele, and in fact it's difficult to imagine how. But each interprets the overall theme within its local cultural context and physical landscape, and so appropriates it for its own political needs. Such variations include the absence or presence of jewelry, deities, beards, the posture and attire of fallen enemies. But note, however, how none of the royal figures, at least, chooses to portray themselves in animal skins and with long hair, although the fallen figures at the Bandigaur are portrayed in that way. Among the most prominent of the Zagros monument patrons are the ones that you see here, Idinsin of Simurum at Bitwata and Anubanini of Lulubum at Saripoli Zohab across the border in western Iran. Both postdate Akkad's demise, and both locations were marked repeatedly with landscape monuments, suggesting a multi-generational practice with its apex in the final third and early second millennium. Lulubum and Simurum are two highland polities, mentioned, albeit not in much detail, in Mesopotamian texts since the days of Naram-Sin, and both stood in repeated military conflict with Mesopotamia as a succession of lowland states sought to expand control over the region. Lowland sources and monument inscriptions also indicate a complex and shifting political asymmetries among different Zagros polities. The relief of Debandi Belula is carved high up on a vertical cliff near the Iraq-Iran border, and has been on the receiving end of many a Mesopotamia file's disdain and criticism. Barthel described it as provincial rustical. Wooden and lifeless was Herzfeld's assessment. And sure, the proportions seem a little odd to the modern observer, and mistakes or idiosyncrasies in the inscription have been identified. But that too tells us something more interesting about access to skilled labor and the potential range of highland elites partaking in this political and ideological discourse. A discourse that has a new lease of life, as the Zagros monuments and the polities of Lulubum and Simurum provide the foundation myth of an ongoing or an emerging Kurdish national narrative, a highland one, at great pains to distinguish itself from its most recent Mesopotamian oppressor. It also just so happens that the Bandi Belula relief is located inside the research area of the Sirwan Regional Project, SRP, which I've been directing with Jessica Sana and Emre Sherifolo since 2013. This offers the opportunity to contextualize the anecdotal evidence for different forms of highland-lowland interaction, shared cultural practices, and local pathways towards increasing centralization, which we gain from these monuments and scanned textual sources in regional and long-term archaeological frameworks. Much like the rest of the Kurdish region, until 4 to 5 years ago, the upper reaches of the Sirwan or Diyala River were virtually unknown archaeologically before the start of SRP. The region forms an important highland-lowland transitional zone that connects the Sharazor with South Mesopotamia and lies along the Khorasan highway that leads into Iran and ultimately Central Asia. Sitting astride the 250mm isohate, it straddles the transition from rain-fed to irrigation agriculture, and from what we know at the moment, formed the cultural watershed from the Neolithic onwards. It's also a border zone throughout its known history, between Assyria and its Iranian adversaries, Rome and the Parthian and Sasanian empires, the Ottoman and the Persian empires, and it is still one today between modern-day Iraq and Iran. One of the most fundamental challenges of work here is the same as in the Cide region, the archaeological knowledge that we bring to it, i.e. the cultural traditions that are readily recognizable and datable, are those of lowland Mesopotamia and in some very rare cases Highland Iran. What is different are the survey conditions and the overwhelming abundance of sites, as well as our ability to implement a methodology that combines survey and targeted excavation at a regional scale. So far, we have identified over 500 archaeological sites through satellite-based remote sensing, ground-toothed about 100, carried out geophysical surveys at 4, and targeted excavations at 2. And both survey and excavation data are starting to yield the sort of local idiosyncrasies I'm looking for over time and between different parts of the survey area, which is almost exactly the size of Rhode Island, although I think it's more impressive if I say half of Cyprus. A few brief examples. So, a late Neolithic 6th millennium village shows material typical of the Hassuna period. At the same time, the assemblage also markedly differs from those of neighboring regions, areas lacking painted and painted in size pottery, either of the Hassuna or the Samara traditions. Bar a handful of beveled rim bowls from a single site, we as yet lack evidence for the so-called Uruk expansion, the establishment of South Mesopotamian colonial settlements and enclaves in late 4th millennium BC. That is attested across Syria, eastern Turkey, and Iran. When such sites are abundantly attested just to the north and the Shah Azor and other parts of northeast Iraq. Sites dating to the 3rd and 2nd millennia, contemporary with the rock reliefs, are numerous and include often large sites with material culture that ties in, at least in part, with recognizable South Mesopotamian traditions. We are planning a full-blown excavation at this 2nd millennium site, where geophysical work and test excavations indicate the presence of some very large rectangular structures destroyed by fire and C14 dated somewhere in the 13th century. This, together with SRP's regional data, will allow us to investigate, among other things, questions of political centralization, its particular local guise, and the relationship with lowland interaction that is hinted at in those monuments. But here's an example of the types of questions that I really want to ask of the data that we've gathered already and the ones that we will ask in the future. Beer is a staple of ancient Mesopotamian diet, consumed by state-dependent workers and elites alike. Wine was the prerogative of elites and cult practices and had to be imported, and one source for this is the Zagros, where grape is native and deliberate fermentation is documented from the Neolithic. I'm interested in the geographies of movement of these beverages, the context of their production and the material culture and practices of their consumption, and the social and cultural identities, some of them Highland and Lowland among others, that they will have helped to construct. In collaboration with an international team of specialists, this involves the analysis of ceramic containers, likely used for the production, storage, and consumption of liquids, using methods from organic geochemistry to identify the residues of perishable substances, combined with archaeobotanical and archaeometric and macroscopic analysis to identify local and non-local character of ingredients and containers. Ultimately, the aim is to be able to plot the regional and wider distributions of such containers, their production and consumption contexts, and together with other patterned information of this type, the result of isotope analysis to track animal and human mobility, to begin to trace wider networks of interaction on the one hand and characterize the local communities partaking in them on the other. But before you start asking yourself the same question, let me conclude. There are many more mountains to climb when it comes to understanding the ancient Near Eastern Highland communities and their lowland connections. But we can start by removing some of the intellectual molehills that have accumulated over the millennia. First, by deconstructing Enmarkar's and Naram-Sin's lowland narratives of civilization and trace the ways in which they have translated into academic practice. From the questions we ask, the places we survey, to what we think we already know about the timings of culture contact and the directions of their flows. The state may not climb hills, but aspects of high culture sure seem to have a habit of doing that. And secondly, by focusing on the insistence on difference in lowland rhetoric and by focusing not on the insistence of difference in lowland rhetoric and the punctuated and often violent episodes they are embedded in, but on the underlying social and cultural relations that they express. This, I have argued, requires a shift in attention from the lowlands onto the highlands and transitional landscapes and their communities such as those of Cide and the Sirwan Valley. As a first step, this involves building an understanding of what is local in material culture terms and behavioral terms by removing traditional period boundaries and to identify evidence for ongoing Highland-lowland encounters. In the central Turkish Black Sea region, this approach demonstrates a long-term persistence of place and significant continuities in ways of doing from the 6th to the 2nd millennium BC. This allows us to reject traditional Kaska invasion scenarios. The regionalism it identifies is not surprising in a landscape as rugged as that of northern Turkey, and I have no doubt that what we see in material culture would have had equivalents in other domains, such as language and dialects. And that puts into question the category of the Kaska, even if one Hittite source talks of 12 different groups, as an imperial umbrella term for people beyond its reach, with probably little resonance with those labeled in this manner. Was northern Anatolia in the late Bronze Age a shatter zone in Scots terms? There are certainly signs that the border zone encouraged some to flee the grip of the Hittite state, in particular if, as both text and the architecture at Dumanla Kale indicate, the border zone was an increasingly diverse amalgam of soldiers, deportees and Kaska, all with limited or no allegiance to the state and firm social ties. The Central Anatolian material culture at Oxula and other sites in Kastamonu could be the product of Hittite state refugees, but other forms of interaction, including repeated returns of specialists or residents, are equally imaginable. 1,300 kilometers to the southeast, and also spanning the late 3rd and early 2nd millennia, we saw another set of Highland-lowland relations expressed in a series of monuments of and in the western Zagros landscapes. These, despite Naram Sin's insistence on Lulubai difference and lack of civilization, express a multitude of connections between lowland Mesopotamia and the emergent political entities of the western Zagros Piedmont. The details of these encounters and the ways in which they shape local identities beyond royal representation, such as in the choice or access of particular foods and drinks, and the forms of political organization that developed as a result of this interaction, are questions for future stages of research. Thank you.
Promised you a wide-ranging talk, and that's exactly what we got. And I'm sure Claudia would welcome questions on aspects of this problem. Peter.
The Levant has a long history of vertical transhuman pastoralism, and there's clearly a Highland-lowland dimension to that. There are various manifestations where you have the same group going to the mountains during the summer, or you have distinct ethnic groups, traditions which persist to the present. I'm wondering if there's much archaeological evidence for this. I know people who've done ethnoarchaeology on transhumans in Greece, but I'm wondering in the areas where you're working whether this comes into play at all.
Yes.
Next.
So there are the highlands and the lowlands, but these are different highlands and different lowlands with very different ecologies in the case of the Pontic Mountains and, say, the Zagros. That said, in recent ethnographic history, but also historical sources, we know that transhumance is a big part of local economy. The question is, how far back does that go? And the idea of nomadism in the sort of pre-second millennium is something that's been recently questioned for the Zagros, for instance. The problem is with identifying sites this early that could be interpreted as transhuman sites, I think is part of the biggest problem. So I think it's a question that's come up more recently, again, as a reason. We've assumed that exists, and that is a mode of, an economic mode of existence in the distant past. But more recently, I think this has returned to being a research question that needs exploration. And one way that I would like to tackle it is through this isotope work with Jessica Pearson at Liverpool, to be able to see if we can see the movement of animals and people in altitude as well as horizontally.
Thank you.
Just as could you give us some elevations, just like how meters above sea level for, or I've never been to these places. How, I mean, are these people puffing? I mean, is it thin air and all that stuff?
We were puffing.
You were
up.
puffing, yeah. Right.
I mean, the Pontic go, depending where you are, but they go up to 3,000
Okay.
thereabouts meters. Not so much where we were working, they're a little bit smaller, but big enough. Modern settlement in the area tends not to go much beyond 700 meters, with transhuman stations up to about 1,000. And we've assumed that that is probably a good indication of where settlements would be also located in the past.
And SRPs?
I'm not that sure yet, to be honest. That's an area that still needs work and understanding, yeah.
Willis?
I just had a question too. I really appreciate your sort of broad narrative in looking at these different places, and I was wondering to what degree you could almost extend this in a microcosm in an urban landscape where you do have highs and lows, and you have movement between the high and low. And I'm thinking particularly of Hittite texts that talk about people going down to the city and then returning up to the temple. And so, to what degree do you see any sort of interplay between elevation and sort of the royal narrative, but elevation within an urban context?
That's a really good question. I've not thought about this before. Thank you. I think it is. I would say it does not tie in directly in the wider Highland-lowland theme, the macro scale that I'm looking at here. Now the question is the Hittite capital in some ways a reflection or replication of what is a wider geographically or imagination of geography of the plateau and its surrounding? Here's a new idea we could talk about, I think.
Sam?
Yeah, I guess this is awesome. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I kind of have a two-part question, and the first is sort of, what about marine resource exploitation, mostly thinking about north, about the Black Sea, and then also how might that affect the Highland-lowland relationship, particularly because the lowlands want to go through that.
Another really good question. The problem with the there are several issues with the Black Sea that make it a very different place to, say, the contemporary Mediterranean. One is that it's a very difficult environment to navigate. It's the hostile sea. The weather changes frequently. It's much more difficult so early seafaring. We have no evidence for early seafaring in the same way as we have in the Mediterranean before good colonization, basically. There are no shipwrecks. There's no iconography that would suggest longer distance seafaring in the Black Sea. That doesn't mean that there aren't any fishing boats or cabotage along the coast, but there's actually no evidence to work with. As to marine exploitation, that would require an excavation where we have the kind of data that we could explore that with. I mean, I'm again, sure enough they were using the sea, I would say, in one way or another, but there is as yet no data to work with. So yes, it is part of the region's connectivity, but how exactly is at the moment. The connections to Western Anatolia are interesting in that regard in the EB material. And they could be a sea-based one, but there's no argument to be made one way or another at the moment with evidence.
Other questions? Graham?
How much does the control of and access to resources, you mentioned timber, but also water, link highland and lowland in the regions that you're looking at?
Depends which one. I think water is not a concern in the Black Sea. Rain falls year-round up to 1,000 milliliter. So it's a very wet, lush area that requires no access to. That there's no argument. I mean, it is not a scarce resource that one could control in any way, or want to control. Certainly, control over water is an issue in the in the Mesopotamian context. Now, Assyrian rulers mark springs and create dams and canals from water that's obviously coming down the mountains. But you're right, it is a concern that's a particularly modern concern of water resources that are coming from the mountains.
So is there therefore in these different regions, different kinds of connectivity between highlands and lowlands, given that access to resources aren't necessarily the same in highland and lowland areas all across the Mediterranean areas? It's not the same kind of relationship.
No. I think there are themes that link highlands and lowlands, and the representation and the alterity narrative. That is something that links highlands in the ancient Near East and beyond. But more specific aspects of the kind of resources that are of interest and how these relationships are articulated, yes, I think they differ in different highland-lowland contexts, and they also differ through time, and depending who's in the lowlands and who's in the highlands.
Mega, you were gazing dreamily at the shirts, I noticed. But I won't press you for a question. Other questions? Felipe.
Thank you for the talk. So this narrative of the Kaska is very strong in the text, and you see sort of a very pejorative attitude to these mountain people. But at the same time, in the text and in the art, the mountains are personified. Everybody's swearing by mountains. The mountains continue to be sort of central aspects of Anatolian religion well into the Roman period. How do you explain sort of that contradiction between sort of very dismissive attitudes towards the people, but almost literal veneration of the mountains as entities?
Yeah, it's complicated. I think that obviously one does not exclude the other. Mountains, the Hittite, depending, there's different kinds of highlands and lowlands, and the Hittites too are highland people in some way, in the sense that they're surrounded by these mountains, and so it seems obvious that they would play a role in their ritual and religious imagination as well as their geographical imagination, and that to them it certainly seems no contradiction that the people who live in the mountains are troublesome and don't seem to be controllable in the way that they would like. So I think there isn't a problem in a sense that there's no contradiction to the Hittites, so there shouldn't be one for us, I think.
I'm curious, this dichotomy, highland, lowland, and civilization, and the Lulubees, or you say you said this is the first place where this narrative kind of develops. I mean, do you think it then gets picked up by other cultures and spreads, or is it just kind of this innate sense of separation and distance and difference? I mean.
I think probably both, in the sense that these narratives seem to go across, China, Morocco. But yeah, I'm talking with Matthew already about scholarship and how these texts are being reread and reproduced, and how certainly these stereotypes would become ingrained in people's ideas and passed on to new generations. So yes, I think there is an aspect to that, and it just in the way that these texts and iconography have worked their way into our imagination and our way of perceiving these places and people.
Very interesting, old world, new world, Peter, you want to come back?
Well, I respond to that the disdain is mutual. I mean, we hear the civilization narrative, but if you talk to the Highland people, they've got no use whatsoever for the lowland people. And so it is a mutual derogation on both parts.
Peter.
Well, I thought it was a fascinating talk, and what sort of struck me in particular, this last discussion brings it out a little bit, is you were emphasizing the interaction, of course, between the two, but still in an antagonistic way, because it's talk about exploitation, minerals that are sort of taken away, and all of that. But it doesn't necessarily, that is obviously sort of one element of it, but also in a more sort of collaborative or cooperative way, and pastoralism, as already the first question was about, I think would have been one more symbiotic relationship between those areas. And can you think of other elements that sort of would play out in that way?
Well, Maybe I didn't make my emphasis strong enough in the talk, in that sense that this is the narrative that we've been latching on in the past, the kind of narrative we see in reliefs and texts. But the data from Cide, for instance, would speak of a relationship that's different, or that's another aspect of that relationship. And in this particular case, it has to be something to do with either a lowland potter or potters moving in the area, or it has to be highland people who, for whatever reason, get to learn these skills and how to make the central Anatolian material and then move back up. So that the material, I think, does yield these alternative narratives. And I'm hoping that by looking at consumption patterns and more detail at the production sequences of these vessels, etc., that we get at these alternative ways of interacting that, again, may not be contradicting the more violent encounters that clearly seem to have taken place as well.
Other questions? John, please.
Thank you. I want to almost come back to sort of to add on to Felipe's question about the this dichotomy between the sort of antagonism and then also the sort of romanticization and veneration. And I want to ask you whether you think this is specifically a mountain lowland case, or whether this is something that's also seen more generally in terms of urban countryside. So whether, I mean, in the same way that you have, those country bumpkins who live in the countryside, who are all stupid, but we also, have this romantic view of the beauty of the countryside and things like that. So whether this is, whether some of these things you're finding are specifically to do with mountainous environments, or whether they're just places that are, less inhabited.
I think the boundary there is it blurs and it interconnects in that, yes, from the lowland urban point of view, anything beyond the city wall is wilderness of some kind, and so yes, the mountains are part of that wilderness, but there is also evidence for quite specific mountain narratives within that. So yeah, I think you're right. It is part of the inside-outside perception of certainly Mesopotamian and to a degree Hittite views of urban existence. Certainly.
Sheila, please.
Yeah, I was struck by the remoteness of many of the sites that you're looking at, the rock carvings that you seem to have to rappel up to get to, and that remarkable cave where you climb a mountain and rappel back down again. And I wonder if there's some, and it may be too early for you to say how typical this is, that who's going to these places and they're already remote, and then you make them even more remote by carving them, accentuating particular places that are difficult of access.
I mean, the rock monuments as such are not exactly remote in that they often relate to communication corridors of some form. Now, they're sometimes difficult to get to the actual relief, like in this case I've tried twice and miserably failed so far, and next time I'm taking climbing gear. But they're not, I mean, in northeast Kurdistan is remote in various ways, but these are communications. So this particular relief also allows access into western Iran that ultimately leads into the Khorasan highway, and the same applies to some of the other reliefs that are dotted around the Sharazor, which is one of the bread baskets of the area. The cave is certainly remote, I think. The pottery in it, especially the one for the 3rd millennium, has these clear connections to what's going on in western and central Anatolia at the same time. And the petrographic and chemical work that we've done suggests a very diverse sources. Now, whether that's a diversity that's in the region that is so mountainous, or whether these vessels come from further away is something that future work will have to look at. But it does look like that it may be some sort of assembly place where people might be bringing things from elsewhere, and so referencing things that are going on at quite some distance.
Laurel.
I'm glad you're attacking this narrative. It's something I love, that we're handed this ideological perfect picture of an opposition, and that's clearly not that simple in reality. But then I'm wondering what the purpose of the ideologically concise and consistent statement is. Why are the mountains vilified, what's the need? If they're not in fact a location from which you can expect to be attacked, if they are in fact a place with which you have a reciprocal relationship, what's the point of the picture?
Identity formation of a state ideology that's emerging and that requires an other to define itself against, I think is the broader explanation. And I've not had time to think about this in more detail, but I think what Edmund Leach is saying in that it is that this rhetoric of difference is a way of structuring relationships. I think that's an idea that's worth exploring further. But I think the more straightforward answer would be that a state is creating an ideology, an identity of itself, and that requires something to contrast with. And the mountains, but also other people in the desert or other places serve as that other to bounce yourself off against.
I think Claudia has clearly demonstrated her courage as well as her fitness for rappelling and climbing and working in Iraqi Kurdistan and all that. But more than courage, she's also, I think, gotten a lot of questions going, and given mountains and lowlands are things that all cultures have, this is going to help us all. Can I suggest we give Claudia a round of applause?